Modify an old antenna tower to fit a 1,000-watt wind turbine. I found this tower disassembled in a neighbor's front yard and he agreed to sell it for only $100. Sold as is. Now the load capacity of this tower is a bit overkill, but here in these foothills the storm winds can get up to very high speeds and they are gusty and squirrely, often changing directions. So a bit of overkill on the tower isn't a bad thing. Plus it's a kind of tower that can be climbed, and the price was right. Now it's hard to tell in this view, but that really is an 8-foot diameter turbine and it's a 40-foot tall tower. It came with enough sections to where I could have made it a 50 or even a 60-foot tower, but 40 feet tall was enough for this location. Plus, that lowers the pucker factor when climbing to the top. This type of tower is called a guide lattice tower. The lattice meaning that the tower is not a solid pipe, but has an open skeletal structure instead. And the guide means there's guy wires to support the tower. This one has 4 up on top and 4 halfway down. Notice that the top of the tower turns into a round pipe, and that would be called a guide tubular tower if it went all the way to the ground on its own. And it's a common type to use with this wind turbine, but I don't like it because it can't be climbed. But now back to this lattice tower. All the ones I've seen have this horizontal bar in common. This one's angle iron, some of them are just flat, but either way they make a fairly good ladder. And then the heavier duty ones I've seen, they have this diagonal going all the way down. And this tube can vary in thickness too, depending on the load capacity of the tower. Now as for the tower base, this came just like it is here. I didn't do anything to it except clean it up and paint it. So the tower's welded to this 1/4-inch thick steel plate, and the plate's connected to the concrete in these 4 areas with anchor studs. But there are 6 anchor studs, not 4, and I'll explain why. This plate is welded to this round shaft all along there, and then the shaft is cradled in these 2 saddles, and they're acting as a hinge. So, aha, this tower can be tilted down and raised back up on those hinges. So this is called a tilt-up or tilt tower, and we'll get to see it in action coming up in a bit here. But first, here's a few more details about the tower and how it arrived as a fixer-upper. It didn't come looking quite this bad. This has been outside for 8 years more and went through a bit of a wildfire too. But it did have some rust and needed painting. Altogether, it came with 6 sections, and 3 of them are of a little bit smaller size pipe and has flat plate horizontals as shown here, unlike the angle iron horizontals that I first showed on the tower base section. Like I said, it didn't look near this bad when I first got it, but it did need a lot of wire brush scrubbing and sandpaper work before I could paint it. Now, talking about the load bearing capacity of this tower, there are a lot of different ones that look the same and are the same size, but they aren't the same at all. This one is a much thinner gauge pipe, and the horizontals are just very thin stamped metal pieces. But even this thinner, lighter duty version would be okay for my project. But this place where the turbine would go is way too small. I just decided to go with the heavier duty version. Now the upper 2 sections of the tower are the smaller with the flat bar horizontals, and so they only have a 2-bolt splint connecting the 2 tower segments together. The lower section, like this one, With the angle iron horizontals, they have a longer splice with 4 bolts per splice. Now, to have the tilting function work on this tower, there has to be 4 guy wires, and this was my way of making 4 guy wires connect to a 3-sided tower. This is halfway up the tower where the lower guy wires connect. And these are stainless steel eye bolts. The eye is welded shut to itself, and it's welded onto the pipe, and it goes through a drilled hole, and it's welded on the other side. I'm using stainless steel 308L welding rod. The other 3 eye bolts are welded into a ground out ditch in the horizontal bar, and it goes across here and it's welded into another ditch there. This is another eye bolt for the other side, and it comes across and same thing, welded into a ditch there. And the 4th one, it's welded there to both cross bolts, comes down and it's welded into a ditch in that horizontal. Keep in mind, these lower cable supports don't need to handle near as much force as the upper cables do, and they've performed quite well over the past 8+ years. Here's the top of the tower, and that's the wind turbine without its blades. To figure out what size pipe this should be, the turbine installation manual would have those specs. For this one, it was a 4-inch pipe. Here's the very important junction where the lattice tower meets the turbine's pipe, and you can see the guy cable connections. And there's the tower going on down to the base with the concrete slab and the tilt mechanism in place. So, to join the lattice tower to this pipe, see this horizontal here? Well, the last set of horizontals that went here, I cut them off. Then I heated this part up red hot and bent this tube in till it touched the turbine pipe. Then I added these 1/8-inch thick steel plates, and they're welded along the turbine pipe there. And there's 2 of them for each lattice tower tube, and they're welded on there and there. And then there's a flat washer there that's been caulked on and plugged up so that rainwater can't go down in that tube. Okay, now the way I hook the other end of this turbine pipe to the lattice tower is here, and I just found an old scrap disc, 1/4-inch thick steel plate, but it could be any shape as long as it straddles over the horizontal triangle, and you can see where it's been welded together. And it also has a hole in the bottom to let the electrical wiring out from the turbine. As for connecting the upper guy cables to the tower, these are the same stainless steel eye bolts. But looking back on it now, I should have used a larger size eye bolt here on the upper cables, but I'll just have to go with these for now. And as before, the eye bolt loop is welded to itself, then it's welded to the tube on the lattice tower, then there's a drilled hole there, it passes through and it's welded. Now the remaining 3 eye bolts are installed differently. The first part looks the same. Eye bolt's closed, it's welded to the pipe, but it passes through a drilled hole to the other side, comes out another drilled hole, and it's welded again there. Same with this one. Passes through a drilled hole, comes out the other side, and welded there. And this one, same, passes through, welded there. So how long should this turbine pipe be? Well, from here down to where the lattice tower starts should be a little bit longer than the length of the turbine blades, as specified in my turbine's installation manual. As for the distance from here down to this disc, I just made it the same distance as the part sticking above to the turbine. The length is not critical, it's just the longer it is, the more strength it has to hold the upper part with the turbine steady. Now to use this tower's tilt feature and raise it up with a winch, this is the one that's going to take all the force, and it's much more force than it will experience when the tower is upright and in the wind. But looking at it now, I wished I had made a reinforcing piece of steel here to make this eye bolt stronger against the winch force. Say a piece of metal welded to the eye bolt and then welded down there. But I don't have it there. I didn't do it. So I don't trust that eye bolt to lift this with the winch. So I put the winch's cable directly on this place a little lower, and it's very strong because you can see that horizontals and diagonals are all coming together there. It's nice and strong because, like I said, there's a tremendous large amount of force pulling on this joint when the tower's first lifted off the ground. So here's the setup with the turbine blades installed and the two side guy wires going down to their concrete foundations. And normally this would be the guy wire that goes to the winch. So this is showing a basic idea of how the tower raising goes. Keep in mind that this is sped up, and there were a lot of breaks in between when I was going up and checking the tension on the two side cables. In other words, this isn't a video about how to raise a tilt tower. I'm just showing some general overview. It's the exciting part. You've probably noticed this other post coming up here, and that's called a gin pole, and it's necessary to create an angle between the winch cable and the tower. There's got to be an angle between here and here when you're first coming off the ground, or the winch wouldn't have a chance. Here's my winch coming down and hooking to my upside down trailer hitch on my truck. Hooked to my homemade from scratch suicide clutch winch. I do not loan it out to anybody, but it has served me well over 25 years. And you can see the cable going up over the gin pole and on up to the tower. Here's a look at the base. The gin pole is just temporarily stuck in the ground. The force of the cable pushes it in and holds it. And you see there's the winch cable going up over the gin pole. And then these are two trucker's ropes that go off to each side to keep the gin pole from falling sideways. This is just another view of the truck, the chain, the winch, and the cable. Now here it is a little while later, and the tower's getting up so high the cable has lifted off the winch pole completely. And I'm coming up there to pull the gin pole out of the ground and lay it down so it doesn't fall on me later when I'm not looking. When the tower gets raised up to this height, the force on the winching gets less and less and less. It's very easy to winch. You can see me down in the lower right corner cranking away. As the tower gets close to vertical, the turbine will unfurl. Have to listen. There it is. It's actually more level than it looks. I didn't have the camera adjusted quite right. There we go. Now it's just a matter of tensioning up all the guy cables. Well, that's pretty much it, but I thought I'd mention these concrete guy wire anchors. They're way bigger under the ground, heavy, deep. And I'm going to add in some turnbuckles so I can adjust the tension on the cables. And here they are. But they're kind of cramped together there on that eye bolt, so I'm going to add these chain quick links to get the turnbuckles away from each other a little bit. The lower one is to the lower cables and it doesn't need as much strength, so I'm taking it down to a smaller quick link and it's got a smaller turnbuckle. The upper cable takes most of the force, so I'm using just the big quick link and a bigger turnbuckle, and that's basically how they go. So after the tower is tilted upright, these two studs have to have nuts and washers put on them. I used stainless steel. I wanted to show my lightning surge protection. There's a ground rod that's connected to the tower, and that goes 8 feet into the ground. And those are the proper connections and the solid copper wire and connected to the tower. And a further step for lightning surge protection is this surge protection device. It should be in an enclosed outdoor rated box, but this was just temporary emergency last winter. Check out the last minute of this video for some windmill lightning fun. Before we go, I wanted to show how the turnbuckles and the guy wires ended up. I only needed to use 3 of these clamps, like you can see there. But on this lower one, the cable was a bit too long, and I didn't want it dangling there, so I put a 4th one to hold it up. And the turnbuckles allow you to tension the cables just right and get the tower totally vertical and plumb. So we say goodbye to our wind turbine hero as it spins slowly off into the sunset. Just one more thing about the height of this tower. There's general agreement that the turbine should be at least 30 feet above any nearby obstructions. And it looks like here the tower's way too low, but actually those bushes and trees are close to me. And off away from this view, it slopes down and there's nothing in the way. And that's where the storm winds come from, so it's a clear shot and the 40-foot tower's quite high enough. Because you see, winter storm winds are what I want. There's no solar electric because it's cloudy, and the storm winds crank this turbine big time, charging large house batteries, often topping them off quite easily. Sometimes having enough surplus where I could have charged the other neighbors' batteries up as well as mine. Oh yeah! And finally, I said that there'd be something about lightning protection at the end. Well, lightning surges can ruin electronic stuff, and it's good to have it. Ooh, look at that. Actually, this lightning was miles away and you couldn't even hear the thunder. But even a mile away or more, the surge can still wreck your equipment, your electric stuff, especially if you have long runs of electric wire between the turbine and your power center. I wouldn't skimp on the lightning protection.